All right, let's round out our discussion of this period of increasing social complexity that's not quite a state, with a couple of examples from the United States, from North America, and then we'll finally finish off with a discussion of Great Zimbabwe in Africa. The first of the examples that I'd like to talk about today is about Chaco Canyon in the U.S. Southwest. It's located in what's now New Mexico, but it's also grew out of an earlier culture, the Hohokam, that in southern Arizona, that covered quite an area, beginning about AD 700. Now we've seen already in previous chapters about the degree of social complexity that North American groups were able to exhibit, even as hunting and gathering communities. But once you start to produce food and live in larger villages, population increases, and we see the growth of social complexity. And so Hohokam is one of these communities, these cultures that starts to increase in their social complexity. And one site, Snaketown, in particular in Arizona, is from about AD 1000, so the year 1000 AD, had some sophisticated architecture. It had a platform mounds with ball courts, and it had a population of a few hundred people, between 300 and 600 people. They also were producing their food in large quantities and controlling labor to do that. So they had irrigation canals that were constructed to produce food in fields. Now, out of this culture, we see a related culture in Chaco Canyon, which is in New Mexico, north the Four Corners region in the northwest of New Mexico. And this is part of what we call the ancestral Puebloan culture, and Chaco Canyon or Chacoan culture is something that is came very close to state level, but not quite. And we'll see the reason why we don't really classify it as a state level culture, because, for instance, it's not clear that there were some of the criteria that Gordon Childe had in terms of trying to identify what is a clear-cut culture. But it certainly was a complex chiefdom of some sort, and had some very impressive features. From about 800 AD, growing out of the Hohokam culture that had preceded it, this site started to grow, and it took over a large network of the Southwest, even having contact with the coast of California. And a whole swath of the U.S. Southwest was sort of a unified culture. It doesn't mean that it was controlled out of a center, but there was a unified identity, that there were similarities of identity and of ideology. There were similar types of pottery. There were similar types of practices and perhaps belief systems that were shared amongst multiple communities, even though that doesn't seem to have been controlled on a state level by a governing authority. And the center of this sort of identity and in fact even a whole settlement network seems to have been Chaco Canyon. And it's now an important archaeological site that you can visit. And there are several what are called great houses, as they're called. And they probably were at some point houses. But once again, we're finding that archaeology isn't just a snapshot of a time in the past. It's actually observing a process. So what might have started out as a household may have become something different through time. And so throughout the lifespan of this village of Chaco Canyon, if it was truly a village, we see perhaps some changing functions. These great houses are reflected in smaller scale across a huge area. And so you find similar forms of architecture, but just much smaller. The same sort of layout of households and the patterns of residence are similar. But when you go to Chaco Canyon, the scale is just enormous. These great houses, as they're called, are multi-story, and they have just hundreds of rooms in them. And so why don't we call them palaces? Well, because it doesn't seem as though these had the same function of what we would call a palace as we'll see in chapter 11 in Mesopotamia, for instance, or elite residences of Mesoamerica that we'll see in chapter 12. Not chapter 12, chapter 13. So the Chaco Canyon is a marginal environment, and so there are sparse resources that needed to be conserved. And so you also find, in addition to these great houses, these large residences, the multi-story structures, you find things like dams, canals, and cisterns for controlling the water supply. One of the largest of these great houses is referred to as Pueblo Bonito, and this was constructed over a 200-year period. So it wasn't just built overnight, or even in a single lifespan. From about AD 100 to about 1000 or 1100 AD. It was constructed, and there's wood that's still preserved in the lintels and in portions of the construction that dendrochronology has dated fairly precisely. It has about 650 rooms arranged in a semicircular pattern, so it's sort of a horseshoe shape around a great central plaza, and it covers 2 acres. So when I say huge, I mean this is a huge structure. 650 rooms is big by any standard. And so if this is a single household, what's going on, right? It has over 20 kivas. And kivas are semi-subterranean or subterranean ceremonial centers. It's often thought that these were sort of they were to represent the underworld or some passage to a spiritual realm, and they had ritual functions. So 20 of these. It's not a perfect analogy, but they're sort of like chapels, right? So how many rooms do you need in a house? How many ceremonial centers do you need in a house? There aren't very many fireplaces, however. So if you would expect that this was purely domestic, you would expect perhaps more hearths. And with 650 rooms, how many people could be there at any given time? It could be it's estimated that it could have been up to 1,200 people in just this one structure, Pueblo Bonito, but it could have been maybe 100 people that occupied this space. And then it was abandoned by about 1250 AD. So some speculate that the functions changed over time, that it could have started out as the establishment of an elite residence, that it might actually have been something akin to a residential palace, or a chieftain's residence. From about AD 1000 or 800 to about 1000, and then by about 1000 AD, it had shifted to a more ceremonial function, which may have hollowed it out in terms of its residence. Also, from Pueblo Bonito, you find berms, these large mounds of earth that are plastered over and constructed of waste materials from perhaps usage. The ceramics that were found in these berms, for instance, were not of like serving vessels or everyday utilitarian function. They seem to have been ceremonial. And so this is also the ceremonial aspect of this location seems to have been also seems to be backed up by some elite burials. In rooms 33 and 38, for instance, there were grave goods indicating access to exotic materials from the trade networks at which Chaco Canyon seemed to have been the center of this wide network of exchanges. And also evidence for this being some kind of an elite location for some maybe leaders or chieftains. It was just simply the scale. That if you want to build a household in a horseshoe shape with 4 or 5 rooms, you could probably do that yourself or with a few people. But when you have 650 rooms of stone-built multi-story architecture, it's a much bigger construction project. And so this required 200,000 trees, for instance, and would have required 800,000 person hours of labor. So who was making this? And even though it was constructed over a couple of hundred years, that's a huge investment. And so who's controlling that? What purpose does it serve? I've mentioned that the Chaco Canyon was the center of a trading network. Well, it looks like this was maintained by some roads that actually that connected some of the great houses and also in and out of this center. And the great houses in Chaco Canyon also seem to have architectural similarities amongst one another. So there's a vernacular of architectural style that's shared amongst the Chaco Canyon great houses, but this is also reflected in smaller scale communities across the network, across the cultural area. And so it's possible that Chaco Canyon was a center that other communities around a large area contributed tribute to. There's evidence of non-local pottery that's found at Chaco Canyon, and also even foodstuffs like non-local maize, corn that came from 80 kilometers or so away based on isotope analysis of the corn that was found on the site, that it wasn't grown there. Also, as I've mentioned, there were some ceremonial aspects to some of these great houses, the kivas, which are reflected in other sites around a great area. Not quite so far west as Nevada. You seem to have a drop off of kivas, but the architectural similarities still continue as far west as Nevada. But you also get over this area religious ritual cycles, which may have resulted in seasonal gatherings. And so maybe Chaco Canyon was a location where people came to for pilgrimages, for instance. And maybe this allowed the residents or the people who were overseeing the construction of Chaco Canyon to levy things like taxes. Or maybe they were coercive and they forced people to contribute. But there's no evidence for violence in this respect. There's no evidence for actually the individuals who were of the authorities. And there's not really a great evidence for a huge population at this location. So why did it come about? There's still big questions about Chaco Canyon, and it was once thought that maybe because there was it was an arid, marginal environment, maybe this was consolidation to make the most out of sparse resources. But actually, this idea has been flipped on its head. Lynn Sebastian, in particular, has seen that actually it may be the other way around, that when Chaco Canyon was rising, when it was starting to become a force and a population center, was a time when the area was flush with resources, and so it's possible that the great houses were built during periods of high rainfall when environmental stresses were low. And so it's possible that rather than environmental stresses putting pressure on communities to rally around some leader, it could be the sort of the opposite, that there was abundant resources and competition over who had access to them. So it's possible that the high rainfall led to a food surplus and a cycle of competition, which is why you have multiple great houses at the site of Chaco Canyon. And so you could have had competing elites, maybe in different houses or households that were very flush, Chaco Canyon at the center of a trading network, and trying to jockey for position of who was the big chief. This is there's still questions about Chaco Canyon, but it shows that there were communities that were on the cusp of becoming maybe something larger scale, but the recipe, the ingredients weren't there to actually put it into what we would call a state. That it never crossed that threshold. Another example of this, which maybe even got a little bit closer, is the Mississippian culture of Cahokia. And this is in the near present-day St. Louis, Missouri, on the Mississippi River floodplain. It was located in a swampy wetland area, and Cahokia is a culture over a large area in the Midwest that existed from about 1000 to 1400 AD. And Cahokia itself, this site, is the largest of this culture, about 4.5 square kilometers. That's a huge area. It had a population anywhere of from 4,000 to 40,000 persons, and had over 100 earthen mounds constructed on the site. Many burials and many public areas like plazas, and also was circumscribed by a palisade wall. One of the mounds on the site, a monk's mound, is 30 meters high, which is 100 feet tall. It encompasses 60,000 square meters, which is 15 acres. It's a huge, huge mound. And that's 600,000 square cubic meters of earth, and it's just a huge amount of effort to do this. So you've got to think, why are people doing this? How are they organizing themselves? Who's organizing them, and for what purpose? So was this a single chiefdom that was like getting close to being on the verge of a state? Who ruled Cahokia and its surroundings? It seems as though there was limited power, however, and so perhaps these were competing chiefdoms that were vying for control of this area. And social inequality seems to have been in evidence, because some people were doing the hard labor and then some people were actually controlling that labor. So it seems as though there was a hierarchy that was starting, a social hierarchy that was starting to be established. Another part of the site of Cahokia, Mound 72, is aligned with Monk's Mound that we just saw, and this was a burial. Mound 72 shows that there was an adult male that was buried on a bird-shaped platform with 20,000 shells. Rich grave goods, skilled craftspeople making points and discs, and also sacrificial victims that were interred with this adult male. So this was an elite. This was somebody that was probably a chieftain, and there were people sacrificed at the moment of the burial of this adult, of this chieftain. So sacrificial victims, 4 men were interred there without heads and hands, and 50 young women as well were sacrificed. Is this a state? Well, it's probably pretty close, but it doesn't seem to, we don't have the evidence to show that there was a state level identity. It doesn't fit all of the criteria that Gordon Childe would say ticks off all the boxes for state level identity, but there's a lot of impressive things going on. So perhaps on the cusp, and it's an interesting case where we can talk about what it actually is a state, and when do we find the cutoff? Is it a continuum, or is there something that another category, a chieftain, a chiefdom, a state? Maybe there's something in between. A complex chiefdom is a term that archaeologists tend to use these days. Also at Cahokia there was feasting, so we've seen this in other sites like Durrington Walls and Stonehenge. My site of Prastio Mesorotsos has feasting. This is a little bit earlier. But at Cahokia, there's a midden. Mound 51 covers a rubbish dump with 500,000 seeds, bones of 5,000 deer, and ceramics that represent 18,000 pots. And also there's a plaza that could have held 30,000 people at one time. So this could be a site of community organization. It seems as though certainly there were large groups of people gathering there for some kinds of activities, including sports like chunky, which is rolling some discs and trying to throw spears after them, and this is depicted in some representations that occur. Also, uniform sense of aesthetics. There's artwork that is peculiar to Cahokia, with especially bird motifs. There's a birdman tablet, and so the bird and the birdman is a repeated motif that you find frequently. Also the use of shells in construction and that sort of a thing.